Hello, students. Welcome to Chapter 10 on emotion and motivation. There are a lot of things in this slideshow. Some of them we will just barely touch on. Some of them we'll dive into in a little more depth. Feel free to reread over sections in the textbook, but some of these things that are in the slideshow are definitely not in the textbook. As a reminder, some of the videos that we watch in these lecture slides while doing this recording might pull a copyright strike. So if there's ever a section that is, say, muted or something like that, you can't hear the audio, just go to these slides, click on the actual video, and then come back to this. So let's get into this lecture recording. So this is a chapter on motivation, and then we have a big section on emotion. They are related, but I wanted you to look at this nice little picture, this motivational poster. So if a pretty poster and a cute saying are all it takes to motivate you, you probably have a very easy job and the kind that robots will be doing soon. So hopefully that motivates you to continue on with your education, get a job that robots can't do, but we'll see. We'll see, right? Hopefully we change systems so that with the robots doing all the jobs, humans can do things that we want to do. Maybe things like reading and writing and doing art. I do like teaching, so maybe I'll still be able to do that after the robots take over. So motivation are the forces that move, the things that move us to do things that we want to do. And we'll talk about a bunch of different things. We'll talk about eating. We'll talk about sex. We'll talk about intrinsic motivation to do something like create. So that kind of force, that energy to do something, that is motivation. So motivation energizes us, it directs us, it sustains behavior. And so it is how we have those wants or needs that direct that goal-directed behavior. So, intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, you've probably heard these terms, and we'll talk about them, but we'll also talk about a lot of other motivational theories and their connection to motivation. So, intrinsic motivation is coming from within, like I want to master the topic of heroism. I want to learn about psychology. I want to do really well at this specific way of playing the piano. Extrinsic motivation is something outside, some reward or punishment. Basically, everything that we talked about in our learning chapter in regards to, so that was like week 4, chapter 6, reinforcement, punishment. That's all extrinsic motivation. Maybe you really like to do your job because you really like the work that you're doing. Or maybe you go to your job so you can get a paycheck, so you can have food and a place to live. That's extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic, I like my job. That would be intrinsic. Extrinsic would be like, I go to my job so I can pay for my rent. That would be an extrinsic motivator. So we think that some things are instincts. So they're unlearned behavior. We talked about this in that chapter on learning. And so we think evolutionarily we have motivations for some things to keep humans alive. So things like eating, things like sex, things like group behaviors. Some of our motivations might be evolved evolutionarily over time. So they might be partially evolutionary instincts, but it can't explain every single behavior. But a lot of different behaviors might have started, and a lot of motivations might have started from some kind of evolutionary core. So a lot of the need and drive motivation theories kind of come from this idea. So a need in a drive reduction theory is that kind of physical or biological deprivation that drives us to fix it. So we might have a biological need of water. So I'm dehydrated, I need water, so I am now driven to go and fill up my water bottle or to crawl to the next oasis in a desert, right? Something like that. So the drive is that thirst, that feeling that you have, but it's because of a need, a biological need. So that is drive reduction theory. So with that, your body, the idea behind drive reduction theory is that your body is trying to maintain some balance. So again, it's trying to get to this equilibrium, a steady state, but it doesn't explain all behaviors. So it can explain like our behavior in a house, say turning on the heat or turning on the cool air. So if my house is cold and I am shivering. Well, I have a need, a physiological, biological need for having my body be warm, so I'm driven to turn up the heater. So it's that kind of psychological itch is the drive. And so that's drive reduction. You try to reduce the drive, and it satisfies the need. The drive is to reduce that thing, and now your need is satisfied. So, hunger, you're at homeostasis, but all of a sudden you start feeling hungry. It's getting close to dinner time at the time I'm recording this. So you have a drive to to reduce that feeling of hunger. And so you are now motivated to reduce that drive. So you're driven to the behavior of eating, and now you have satisfied that need. All right. With this, it's really related to this little meme because your body's trying to be at homeostasis. So that drive to eat satisfies that need for food. All right, with this, we have the optimal arousal theory. So this suggests that our performance is best someplace in the middle. If we're bored or tired, we're not very aroused to something, we're not going to perform very well, we're not going to be motivated to do it. Somewhere in here, we'll be motivated to do it, but when we get up to here, we're going to be too stressed. The stimulation level, the arousal level is too high. Now, this can explain behavior in some ways you might be able to, and I'd really ask you in a lot of these cases to pause and think of some of your own examples. So with the drive reduction theory, pause the video, think of your own examples, write them in your notes. Pause the video, write about anything that you feel. If you're too stimulated or it's too stressful, you can't be focused and engaged, you can't be motivated to do it, or maybe you're too bored to do it. Right? See if there's anything you can think about in your own life that would fit this optimal arousal theory. But again, this isn't going to explain everything. We see that professional athletes, they usually set their world records when they are at a higher stress than just their focused engagement during a game. And so you might argue that, well, maybe their focus and engagement level, they have trained and it can actually be higher up here than a standard person. So there's that, but it's at a higher stress level. So it's on the day of the game, on the day of the track meet, on the day of the Olympics that they're setting the records. It's not the day before in practice where they're presumably pretty focused and engaged and they're trying hard. It's when that stress goes up higher. So again, this can explain a lot of behaviors, but doesn't explain everything perfectly. Hunger is a really good example of the drive reduction theory in action, but there's other steps towards that. There's other things that your body is doing. A main thing is the gastric signals, the hormones that your body is releasing to tell you that you need food and to start that motivation to eat, and also to tell you that you're full. So CCK is a hormone that helps start the digestion of food. It also sends messages to the brain to stop eating, but it doesn't really start until your stomach gets full enough. So this is sometimes why people suggest if you're on a diet to eat slowly, because if you have the same portion but you eat it really quickly, your body, you have eaten all of that, and maybe it's exactly what your stomach needs, the exact right amount, but if you eat it so quickly, it takes some time to fill up your stomach and then to have enough CCK in your system to tell your brain that you're full. So if you're eating really fast, you're eating too fast for the CCK to alert your brain. Hormones work a lot slower on average than neurotransmitters. So adrenaline's a very fast one, so like fight and flight response, which we'll talk about later in this class. But CCK, it's pretty slow. You need to fill up so you can imagine this is kind of the level. You got to fill up the stomach to this level. Once it gets to that level, you start releasing the CCK. And so now that it's starting to release, it's got to get to a big enough amount in the bloodstream to be detected by other organs, like the brain, to tell you, oh, hey, I'm actually full. So other chemicals, glucose obviously is a big part of hunger and digestion and eating. It's also needed for brain functions, so we need that glucose. Insulin helps control that glucose, and there's a difference between simple carbs and complex carbs for how much insulin is produced. Also, fat cells. So, leptin is released by fat cells. It decreases your food intake and increases metabolism. So, there's all these systems going on at the same time, telling you how much you should be eating, when you should be eating, that kind of thing. So the lateral hypothalamus is a part of the brain where, and it's close to the center of your brain, if you remember hypothalamus. It's helpful in the initiation of hunger and eating. The ventromedial hypothalamus is really good for the stopping of eating. So again, you've got the brain, you've got the blood, you've got hormone levels, you've got the stomach. They're all communicating with each other, telling you, are you or are you not hungry? So it's a big complex process for the reduction of that to try and have that drive satisfy that need. So, how do we get obese when our body is literally programmed to stop eating? Well, we see a lot of people are obese. 1 in 6 children is obese. About 50% of adults are obese. And there are genetic tendencies. So you might have a genetic set point that is that your weight is higher. And there's not a lot you can do about that genetic set point. Even with that genetic set point, you can still do things like diet and whatnot, but some people's bodies and genetics are just to eat a little bit more, to process the hormone a little more slowly or a little more quickly, to make more or less glucose, to use more or less of the fat cells. There's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. But with that being said, it can help to do certain things like eating slower can help to let those systems of your body work over time. So other things, time and place cues. If you're hanging out in the kitchen where you usually snack, you're going to be a little more likely to snack. Humans really like sugar and high fat things because evolutionarily, sugar and high fat things were really useful for us, but we didn't have a lot of access to them. So our biology had learned that, hey, if you ever got access to something that had more fat, you should eat it. And so we evolved the mutations to like the taste of fatty foods and sugary foods, so that when we came across them, we would eat them more. And that organism who ate more of the sugary and fatty foods was more likely to survive. So thanks, evolution. Now that's why I like Snickers bars, right? Another thing is we as people, when we often eat to empty our plate and eat pretty mindlessly, not really considering how much do I actually need to eat. So measuring portions, things like that. Getting smaller plates in your house can be a big help. One study that they did is really interesting. I don't remember if your book talked about this. Um, but when they've done studies of people eating like a bowl of soup, they essentially have a pipe in the bottom of the bowl of soup and they can keep filling up the soup. So the participants don't realize, but the soup isn't going down. And the people will just keep eating and keep eating quite a lot more. So the people whose bowls kept filling up versus the people who had just a really big bowl, the people whose bowls kept filling up ate, it was like 30, on average, about 30 to 50% more than the group that had just a really big bowl of soup. So we eat pretty mindlessly. We often try to empty our plate. So with this, the drive reduction theory also can explain some of the biology of sex. So some of the similar brain areas are working for sexual motivations as well. So hypothalamus is one that, and sometimes it's called a pleasure center of the brain, but it's not the only one. If you remember back to our discussion in week 3 for biopsychology, there's multiple areas of the brain that are pleasure centers of the brain, but the hypothalamus is connected to the limbic system, connected to the cerebral cortex, and so some of those areas on the cerebral cortex are getting basically the physical sensation signals from around your body, whether it be lips, hands, genitals, whatever it might be. It's also involved in erection in men and orgasm in women. So again, similar to food and digestion of food, there are a lot of systems in your body, a lot of different hormones, a lot of different brain areas that are responsible for sexual motivation as well. So essentially, the biology of sex, the kind of sex process, is oftentimes we get neurotransmitters and sex hormones that start to produce sexual feelings, and that can be triggered by a wide range of things. It might be touch, it might be sight, right? So with those neurotransmitters and those sex hormones going, that leads to what we would call sexual arousal. With that, you have then a desire to engage in sexual behavior. If you do engage in that sexual behavior, well, then you'll start getting that rewarding sensation of dopamine. And then as things build up to orgasm, you get that feeling of calm and relief with a lot of oxytocin at the point of that orgasm. So that's kind of the step-by-step neural process. Again, we're using hormones and different brain areas to go through these different steps. So with that, this is basically humans' sexual response cycle. So that excitement phase can last from minutes to hours. So going back here, so this area right here, the rewarding sensations and lots of dopamine, that excitement phase can last for quite a long time. So that plateau, that increase of blood pressure and pulse, and then leading to the orgasm, which is usually lasting about 3 to 15 seconds for the orgasm itself, which is that explosive discharge of neuromuscular tension. So with that, especially for men, you have a refractory period where a male can't have another orgasm again for some time after that. But that's essentially the pattern that we see. So with this, and with this idea about sex, there's other cognitive factors too. We mentioned a few cognitive factors in food motivation. So things like if this is a place you're usually snacking at, you might be more likely to want to snack. We have sexual scripts as well. We have kind of patterns of expectation of behavior of what we see, what we think should be done. So this is influenced by media, influenced by previous dating. Your sexual scripts might involve love, might involve conquest, might involve recreation, right? And it's also the interpretation of the event, right? So there's thought processes of what you're experiencing. It may or may not lead to that first step of that biology of sex, right? It might lead to, yes, you do have those neurotransmitters and sex hormones producing these feelings, or that might not be happening depending on your sexual scripts. So with that, it also goes into the thoughts of the person. You might have sensory triggers, you might have visual triggers. So these are some other cognitive factors that can be a big part of this whole process. So this is also different across cultures. So different cultures tend to have different sexual scripts, different times, places, how much or how little sex is appropriate. So a lot of cultures have more sex than people in the US tend to have. A lot of cultures have less sex than people in the US tend to have. And there's a range. So what is the kind of cultural factor? What is expected? So behaviors are appropriate or not appropriate. All right, so with this, a lot of research on sexual behavior is done on adolescents. So take a minute and think, why might it be hard to study sexual behavior in adolescents? Maybe write something in your notes. So one of the biggest challenges here is that adolescents like to lie a lot about sex and drug use. So with that, they might say they are sexually active when they're actually not. And they might say that they're not sexually active when they actually are. And this is very common. And so there's different things that you can do for, say, to try and make them more likely to respond honestly. So if you ask, let's say you've got a group of 5 young people, adolescents, and you are looking at them in the face and that's their friends next to them, and you ask them about their sexual behaviors, you're probably not going to get a very good answer. You're probably a little more likely to get a good answer if you give them, say, an anonymous survey. If they can take it at a time and place that they feel comfortable, where there's maybe not someone like looking over their shoulder, you get a little better response. But another thing that you can do is there's lie scales. So you have other questions that a good example of this is asking a bunch of questions like, oh, I always help people. Like things that, well, no, people don't always help. Like you've probably skipped helping someone sometime. Like asking questions to try and gauge, is a person lying about that? And so then if we find that, oh, this participant looks like they are probably lying in other places, we can maybe ignore their data on the sexual behavior items. So that can help a lot to help fix and get a better sense of adolescent sexuality. So with this, adolescent sexual behavior is an important thing to study because it can have a lot of risk factors. And so it's something that is of a lot of concern. It seems that every generation is really worried about the upcoming generation's sexual behaviors. So with this, it can have a lot of risk factors, so it is important to know and help adolescents prepare and be able to emotionally handle sexual experiences. So here are some of those risk factors. Some risk factors. Some of these are correlations, some of these are causation, but it's very correlated with high drug use for early sexual experiences. So that's earlier than 14. Higher probability of delinquency in school problems, higher probability of sexual assault, forced sex, and rape, higher probability of having sex without using protection like a condom, higher probability of pregnancy. Also, if you are in a low SES area and in the inner city, that's also additional risk factors for early sexual experiences. And so these are things that are important to study so we can maybe help reduce some of those risk factors. So something like sex education can help with some of these, right? Helping people understand how to be safe can help with the no condom use, pregnancy, some of these other things. Other things here are the family context. Parents who are more hostile tend to have young adolescents who engage in sexual activity earlier. If the young person has older siblings that are sexually active, they tend to be a little more likely to be sexually active themselves. In single parent homes, especially for girls, they're a little more likely for early sexual activity as well. So, deviant peers in early adolescence is another risk factor. Having lower self regulation, having higher impulsiveness. And a big thing here is because a lot of young people's first sexual experience is often impulsive. So, when we look at on average, a lot of adolescents, whether they're 14, whether they're 17, a lot of times a first sexual experience is pretty impulsive. And this is because it is pretty hormonally charged. If you remember back to our chapter on lifespan development, talking about the prefrontal cortex not finishing its myelination until in the mid 20s, well, one of the areas that is fully myelinated in adolescence is the emotion center of the brain. So those hormones, those feelings, those first parts of that sexual behavior that humans do, it's pretty intense for a young person who doesn't know how to regulate some of those emotions. So, oftentimes, especially, this is oftentimes why we see people who will get pregnant the first time they have sex. Essentially, their body, their hormones, their ovulation cycle, right? Their body's basically primed and ready evolutionarily. It's like this is the time to have a baby. So that's where their hormones are a little more likely. So even if they've planned to say, hey, I'm going to wait, I'm not going to have sex, those hormones start going. They're a little more impulsive. It makes it a lot more likely that maybe since they weren't planning on it, they don't have a condom or something like that, makes it a lot more likely to have a pregnancy in that kind of situation. So this is a pretty common thing to happen. So again, another important reason to know about these patterns and the motivation so we can help with some of those risk factors. That being said, I definitely go over it a lot in my lifespan development class. I think I may have cut it from this class. But yeah, comprehensive sex education is one of the best ways to reduce pretty much all of these risk factors. So another thing is parent warmth and support, having open communication, having family connectedness. These are things having young people feel like they can talk and share with their family. Those are really big. So talking specifically about sexuality. So there shouldn't be the talk. So adolescent sexuality should be something talked about in appropriate ways from the time that they're young. So we respect each other, we don't get in people's boundaries and bubbles, don't touch people that don't want to be touched. These are kinds of conversations that can be had earlier on. Treat people with respect. If someone says no, respect that. These kinds of things are questions that can eventually lead to a really clear conversation about sexual behavior. That if someone says no, you stop, these kinds of things. So that kind of open communication can then become a conversation about sexual behavior. And this shouldn't be, again, a one talk about sexual behavior. This should be open enough communication that this is something that's repeated multiple times. They know what to do. They've talked about different kind of scenarios. That's one of the best protective factors as well. So parent monitoring, so like a parent knowing like where their young adolescent is, what they're doing, friends they're with, that is predictive as well. It's a little bit causal, a little bit correlational, because if they're monitoring, maybe they're also doing some of these other things too. So other things, positive school climate, young people with higher academic achievement or higher self-regulation tend not to have early risky sexual behaviors. Also, internalized pro-social norms and spirituality are correlated with are protective factors for early and risky sexual behavior. So with this is a little bit related, and we touched on this a little bit in our chapter on lifespan development. This is also related to patterns in sexual minority development. So sexual orientation is just simply defined as the direction of your emotional, romantic, or erotic interest. So who is it that starts that process of sexual behavior for you? So with that, usually this attraction to same sex or same sex behavior or identifying as LGBTQ plus occurs in adolescence. But that's not to say that it's not present earlier on. Usually this is a time of identity development in general. So they often coincide. So with that, most crushes are present in childhood as well for a lot of people, LGBTQ plus or not. A lot of times in childhood, you might have a crush, and so you might notice that oh, I like girls or guys or both or all sorts of people, right? So you might start to recognize that and realize and kind of label it as you get into adolescence. Also, it can happen in emerging adulthood, especially for older populations than a lot of the students taking this class. So think like millennials and older generations. It's this kind of emerging adulthood time might have been a time that was they were finally with the kind of laws and acceptance around in the world in their emerging adulthood or later adulthood might finally have been like, oh, hey, yeah, I did have a crush on that person or that group of people and come to that later on too. Oftentimes, also, there's testing out of sexual experiences in adolescence, just like we talked about with identity, testing out different roles. Oftentimes, we see more engaging in relationships in emerging adulthood rather than just sexual experiences. So, adolescents, maybe they have a smaller dating pool. This is often what we see. And then leaving to college or the workplace, the dating pool kind of opens up and they test out rather than just sexual experiences, more long-term dating partners. And so that is a little different. So that kind of long-term dating partners, we see that with heterosexual couples can happen a little bit earlier, like even into high school. With LGBTQ plus couples, oftentimes it's pushed back just a couple of years in the cultural context. So the total percentage of LGBTQ plus people in the world is somewhere between 3 and 20%. It really depends on the study that you look at. If you look at studies that do better methods, studies that are more reliable, it's probably somewhere around 10%, maybe up to like 13 or 14%. But it's hard because there are still populations or worldwide that won't report that they're part of that community. So it does make it a little difficult to assess really accurately, but it's somewhere a little north of that 10% number worldwide. With this, there's other research that's looked at the developmental pathways for sexual minorities. So we've looked at, is there genetic components to sexual orientation? Is there biological components to sexual orientation? That includes like hormones, brain chemistry, brain structures as well, and also cognition and environmental and social factors. So there's a lot of pieces that go into the motivation for who you have a desire for sexually. And essentially what they found is that very similar to someone who is not LGBTQ+, it kind of maps on similarly. There's some genetic component, there's some biological component, there's some cognitive component, and there's some environmental and social component. So hormones seem to have a kind of critical influence in the 2nd to 5th month after conception. So that's in utero before even being born. It seems like there's some correlation with different hormone levels. This is a terrible study as it was done, but it does kind of make me laugh now because the intention of giving gay men male hormones was to try and make them reduce their behavior towards other gay men. So they found that giving gay men male hormones didn't change their sexual orientation, it just increased their desire for sexual behavior. So it's pretty terrible some of the kinds of things that they tried to do to change people's sexual orientations. But this one makes me laugh a little bit because it had the opposite effect that they had intended. They thought, well, maybe they're just not manly enough. Give them more male hormones and they'll like girls. But no, they just increase their sexual desire. And that tends to be the case with testosterone. Higher testosterone tends to increase anyone's sexual desire. And again, every single person, unless you have hormone deficiencies and problems, everybody has testosterones, estrogens, all humans do. All right, so with this, genetics. We see about 35% variation in men and about 19% variation in women can be attributed to genetics. So what I mean by that is if you have two twin men and one is gay, about 35% of the time, the twin is also gay. So that means there is a stronger genetic component than that a little higher than 10% we see in the general population. So there is some genetic component there. But again, it's not exclusively genetic, it's not exclusively socio-emotional, it's a combination of all these factors. So oftentimes, that attraction to same sex starts in childhood. And that's really where sexual attraction, where we see it start for any person in normative development. So oftentimes, sexual attraction is starting in early childhood, especially with in a place where maybe the environment, the family, the community might not be as accepting of LGBTQ plus people. They might not realize that or say, oh, hey, I'm actually attracted to that person until closer to adolescence or even early adulthood. Then they might kind of realize that, oh, hey, that's why I always liked this person, that kind of thing. So, but the development of sexual orientation for LGBTQ plus people is essentially the same as the development of sexual orientation for a heterosexual person. So, starts childhood, there's biological, genetic, socio-emotional components that go into a specific person's sexual orientation. So, early reinforcement and experiences with the same or opposite sex can foster and hinder attractions, same as with anybody else, essentially. So one thing that is often said is that people who are LGBTQ plus are born that way. And so while it could be a useful term to use in a lot of contexts, talking with, say, an uncle at Thanksgiving or something like that, we're talking about psychology, social science. So what does the science actually say? I want to watch a little bit of this video because it goes into it in a little more detail. So there's a more scientifically accurate perspective of how do we develop sexual orientation. And we've touched on a lot of it already right now. But let's get a little more detail here. Again, usually the TED Talks do fine. So, but if for any reason this is muted for you or whatever it might be, go back to the lecture slides and watch it on your own.
True or false? Sexual orientation is something you're born with. Chances are that if you support LGBT rights, you said true. Surveys have found that people who view sexual orientation as an innate trait, like eye color, tend to be more supportive of LGBT rights. Now, why is that? When asked, folks typically say, well, it's just wrong to discriminate against someone for how they're born. It's like ethnic discrimination. Makes sense. So for years, the born that way argument has been used to promote LGBT equality. Lady Gaga's song, Born That Way, even became an unofficial anthem of the gay community. But there are three problems with the born that way argument. First, it's not scientifically accurate. Second, it's not legally necessary. But third, and most important, it's actually unjust. And it's time to retire that argument for LGBT equality.
So jumping in right here, I definitely recommend this whole video, but in class we're only going to watch the argument for that first part, that it's not scientifically accurate. So we'll focus on that. If you want to continue watching the whole thing, feel free to click the link in the slides and go through the rest of the video as well. This is a researcher who studies sexual orientation development and does a lot of longitudinal studies, which they'll talk about in just a moment.
Now, my passion for this issue stems from my own research on sexual orientation. Over 20 years ago, I started a study tracking over time 100 women with different sexual identities. And over the years, I was frankly surprised by some of the changes that they went through. Some of the lesbians ended up involved with men. Some of the heterosexual women ended up getting involved with women. And when these sorts of things would happen, women would say to me that they thought there must be something wrong with them, since their experiences didn't fit the conventional wisdom that sexual orientation is fixed at birth. So that brings us to the first problem with the born that way argument, that it's not scientifically accurate. Now, sexual orientation does often express itself very early and very consistently, but lots of times it doesn't. And it breaks my heart when I hear people express distrust of LGBT individuals who came out late in life, for example, after a heterosexual marriage. People will say things like, how could they not have known all this time? Are they sure that they're really gay? Just imagine how it feels to hear that from someone that you just came out to. But the plain truth is that gender and sexual development show a lot more variability than most people realize. And that variability often leads to change over time in sexual attractions. National and international studies conducted by researchers at Cornell, the Harvard School of Public Health, the University of Virginia, and many others have collectively tracked tens of thousands of individuals for 5, 10, 15 years. And guess what? Sexual attractions show a fair amount of fluidity. Some individuals start out exclusively attracted to one gender, and over time they find themselves attracted to both genders, or vice versa. Some bisexual individuals shift from being more drawn to one gender to being more drawn to the other. Now, what does this fluidity tell us about the innateness of sexual orientation? Nothing. Nothing at all. Because they're completely unrelated. There is, to be sure, strong evidence for genetic contributions to sexual orientation, but those contributions do not cement your entire sexual lifespan from birth. What they do is push its development in a certain direction. If sexuality were totally locked down by genes, well, then if you had two identical twins and one twin was gay, the other twin would be gay 100% of the time because they have the same genes. But in reality, twin studies have found that if you have two identical twins and one twin is gay, the other twin is gay 30 to 40% of the time. Now, that is way higher than you would expect by chance alone, so it is definite evidence that your genes influence your sexual orientation. But your genes do not provide the last word on every sexual feeling you're ever going to have. Now, before moving on, I want to make one thing crystal clear. The fact that sexuality can be fluid does not mean that therapists can cure individuals of same-sex attractions. That's sometimes called conversion therapy, and study after study has shown that it does not work, and it does immense psychological damage, increasing rates of depression, anxiety, suicide attempts. That's why conversion therapy has been discredited by all of these major medical and psychological associations, and it's why all of these former practitioners of conversion therapy have not only shut their own doors, but have publicly apologized to the LGBT community and have joined legal efforts to ban the use of conversion therapy with children and adolescents.
So again, feel free to watch the rest of that on your own time. It's a good one, and it goes into the other arguments they pointed out at the beginning. But that first argument is really the main one that I wanted to get into, because we're talking about motivation leading us to eat. We're talking about motivation for sexual behavior. and also a little bit about sexual orientation and development and change over time. So that sexual orientation, it can be fluid, it can change, it can vary across the lifespan. And I just wanted to reiterate what they said at the end there as well. So this does not mean that you should intentionally try to change someone's sexual orientation. What I mean that it can change over time is that it can on its own change based on all of these factors that we've been talking about. And it would be completely unethical and wrong to try and intentionally change someone's sexual orientation. So, this hopefully gives you a more scientifically accurate perspective of things like motivation to eat, sexual motivations, sexual orientation, because that is a big thing I want to do. And while this isn't a deep dive into these topics, that's a lot of the general psych class, is to just touch a little bit on what some of the research is showing and give you a good little overview and a little bit of depth on a few things. So, we talked about a bunch of things sexual orientation is influenced by. What are some things sexual orientation is not influenced by? It doesn't seem to have any correlation with being reared by a gay parent or a parent who's LGBTQ plus themselves. It doesn't seem to have any correlation with specific parenting styles, specific kind of discipline or reward strategies. It also doesn't seem to be related to childhood sexual experimentation. It's not highly correlated to sexual orientation. So with that, orientation is influenced by genetics, hormones, psychological, social factors, reinforcement of behaviors that you do, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of things that go into the development of the sexual orientation that leads to then the sexual pattern of motivation for sexual behavior. So with this, we see that for gay and lesbian families, they tend to be less likely to have children, but they don't have essentially any measurable differences from children of heterosexual couples. So we see basically same kind of problem behaviors, risk factors, protective factors for families. So they're essentially just a family. So with that, we do see that they sometimes have more egalitarian views of gender, but other than that, a lot of the things that we usually worry about, like early sexual behavior, drug use, school delinquency, holding down a job in life, those kinds of things, grades wise, they seem to be exactly the same as any other children of any other family. So, and next we'll talk about some of the more recent theories in motivation. A lot of these do stem from some like drive reduction idea, but for different theories, that drive is to do something different. So the original ones that we talked about had that kind of evolutionary basis. Well, you've got to eat, you've got to extend the population of humans so that your species can survive. We'll talk about some motivations for other things, and we'll start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and talk about things like self-actualization. But some of these are still have kind of that core bit of having a drive to do something and then a motivation to do that thing. So hopefully you can see those connections. The next motivational theory we'll talk about is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've probably heard of this before. It's a sequence of needs starting from some basic needs like security and survival, and then it moves up to the highest need of self-actualization. So it's similar in a sense to some of the drive reduction theories that we talked about and having needs to motivate you. But for this theory, the idea is that these needs are different than hunger, sex, things that are evolutionary adaptable or adaptive for humans. So the idea here is that each of these needs in this sequence, you have to get these basic needs first, the physiological needs, the safety needs, and then you can move on to love and belongingness, esteem, and self-actualization. Later researchers changed this and revised this a little bit, so realizing that you can do some of the esteem or self-actualization needs even if you don't have some of these basic needs met. But with that being said, it is definitely much easier to worry about things like love and belongingness, self-actualization, if you have your safety and physiological needs met. So this slide has some examples in each of these sections. I definitely recommend you pause it, read over these if you want more examples for these. So when we're talking about physiological needs, these are some of the things like with the drive reduction theory. So sex, sleep, homeostasis, food, water, some of those basic needs. Then safety needs, having security, employment, resources, so property or like a house, things like this. Next, love and belonging, family, friends, sexual intimacy. Esteem needs are things like feeling good about yourself, feeling respected by others. And then self-actualization is kind of the goal of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Self-actualization is that you are doing things that you yourself feel are important, like you are actualizing yourself. You are a full person. So this was kind of seen by Maslow as the highest pinnacle, like the goal, but you had to do these basic needs before you could worry about morality or creativity or spontaneity or problem solving. With these examples, you might be able to see that, yeah, you can, and we see data, and other later researchers have revised this and made new theories kind of based off of this as well, saying, well, yep, you can. You might know people who are very creative or who are solving problems, but they're unhoused, right? They don't know where their next meal is coming from. But that being said, while it is possible to do some of these self-actualization things, it is definitely much easier to do it with the protective factor of having these basic needs met. So that is another example of a type of motivation theory. So the needs here are different than, I mean, we do have the food, water, sex, we do have that on here, but self-actualization is a little different than we might have been thinking about beforehand earlier on in the class. So the next theory to talk about is one that I think is really relevant to a lot of things that you're doing and a lot of your motivation. So again, it's talking about basic needs, but the needs are a little bit different than Maslow's hierarchy. And these don't have a ranking system. All three of these are important for motivation. So these three basic needs that humans have a psychological need for are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So you can see a description of these here, but all those three together lead to motivation. So if a person feels that they have choice, if they feel, let's take a workplace, for example, or maybe a class, hopefully one of the goals of the question paper is that you feel autonomy. You feel like you have choice around it, that you can decide what your topic is, that is something you're interested in. That's trying to get at that autonomy. The competence is building your skills. So we did a reference list, did an outline, doing a first draft. These are trying to build your competence, to experience mastery, to see yourself getting better at different skills. So hopefully you can think of things in school, in home life, if you've ever tried a hobby, something like that. Hopefully you can see how this might fit into your life. And then relatedness is the need to feel belonging or connected to others. And if you're watching this from an online class, we try to do that a little bit in things like discussion boards or feedback from peers. But it's a little easier in, say, a face-to-face class to get relatedness and have groups in that kind of setting. That being said, hopefully you can think of examples in your work, in your home life, in trying to start a new hobby where you felt autonomy, competence, and relatedness that you can put in your own notes and see how that kind of motivated you. That maybe a big part of continuing to do something you're wanting to do was because of that relatedness, right? Or maybe it was because of that autonomy. So neither of these three components are higher or lower just in general, but for you, competence might be the most important, or relatedness might be the most important, or autonomy might be the most important. In research on people who volunteer, a lot of times the people stick with volunteering at, say, a nonprofit because of relatedness, because of the relationships they've built. So at first, a lot of times they talk about, oh, this is a new thing. I like choosing this. This is a cool thing to do. So you're getting a little bit at that autonomy. And a lot of people in volunteering talk about competence. I'm learning new skills. I can see that my skills that I'm bringing to this are really useful. But after they've been doing it a couple of years, they're not doing new things necessarily. And so a lot of it for a lot of people is that relatedness piece to continue motivating them to continue on. And that can be a thing to think about in your work. Let's say you are a manager. You're a manager of a department, of a team of 5 people. Well, do the employees, do the people that you're working with on that team, do they have autonomy? Do they have competence? Do they feel relatedness? If they don't, you can work on those things. And for any given person on the team, maybe for one, they're more motivated by that autonomy piece. Maybe for another, it's the competence and relatedness. Maybe for another, it's just the relatedness. Right? So this is a good model that I think is really applicable to a lot of things. So hopefully you take some good notes. I've got a couple other slides with another couple descriptions of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, but it really is just other examples of the same thing. So here's another description. So competence, another good word for that that I don't think was on the previous one was self-efficacy. We've talked about self-efficacy before. Relatedness, warm relations, feeling belonging, then autonomy, kind of self-reliance, being able to choose things. Here's another slide again. So Richard Ryan, Edward Deci are the originators of self-determination theory. So hopefully in looking at these descriptions, it's pretty concrete. This is one that, if I remember right, was not in your book, or at least not talked about in detail enough. But I think it's really applicable to a lot of aspects of life, and it really goes into some of the psychological needs that we have. And if you have these things, you'll probably feel more motivated and probably a little more happy. If you are being competent, if you see yourself building skills, you will have more self-efficacy. You'll feel good. If you have autonomy, when we ask workers in the workplace, a lot of times the responses that they give of what I like about work or what I wish was changed really ties back into self-determination theory really well. So hopefully you take this with you out of this class. So with that, I do have a video linked here in the slides of one of the original researchers talking about self-determination theory. So if you want more examples, definitely watch that. It's a good video, but right now in the class, we're not going to watch it in this lecture video, but feel free to go and navigate to that on your own. All right, with that, we mentioned this at the beginning of the motivation section. So intrinsic motivation are those things that an organism likes to do, enjoys, are a key piece of achievement, and are things that the organism wants to do on their own. Extrinsic motivators are those rewards, punishments, incentives, those external things. So you could think of intrinsic as internal and extrinsic as external. So those root words there. So hopefully you can think of some things that are internal motivators for you and external motivators. And just because it is an external motivator doesn't mean it's worse or better than an intrinsic motivator. And it really depends on what you're trying to motivate to get done. So I have a question here. Does extrinsic motivation undermine intrinsic motivation? And we have seen some research that it can. So if you have someone who has intrinsic motivation, they really want to do something, they want to learn guitar, for example. They really want to do it, they want to get better at it, they think it's fun. If you start giving them an extrinsic motivator, say making money for playing guitar, oftentimes for a lot of people, that intrinsic motivation decreases. They start doing it for that extrinsic motivator, and that intrinsic or internal motivator can decrease and even die entirely, like just expire. So it is something to watch. If there's something a kid likes to do, let's say your child likes reading. Well, yeah, giving them an extrinsic reward every once in a while for reading, great thing. If they're getting that reward all the time, you might destroy that intrinsic motivation to do the reading. So it is a hard balance to find because for any given person, it's going to be a little bit different. With these motivators, one key piece that we've kind of touched on is self-regulation. And so that's controlling your objectives, setting goals towards meeting your motivation. So planning, monitoring your progress. You see here a person training with a personal trainer. This is kind of an example of, well, you've got some goals, you've got to plan for those goals, so you've got to work out specific amount of time, run a specific amount this quickly, set those goals, and then monitor that progress. So self-regulation is doing that for yourself towards whatever goal it is. Getting better at guitar, getting a research paper in, getting enough applications in, whatever it might be. That process of self-regulation is a really good thing to practice and is really tied into motivation, even though it's not in and of itself like a motivation theory. It's definitely tied to motivation. So when we think about setting goals, the more specific the goals, the better. So specific goals that are a little bit of a stretch, but not too big of a stretch. So if it's If it's too big of a stretch and you're not reaching those goals enough, well, your intrinsic motivation is going to be harder because you're not getting that reward of reaching those goals. So setting realistic goals with definitely making sure that they're a stretch is going to build that self-efficacy. If it's tied to some kind of long-term purpose, something that you want to do long-term, so maybe this class isn't your favorite class you've ever taken, which makes me very sad, but I understand that is the case. Um, Here at Olympic College, we don't have a psychology program right now for a psychology degree. So you're probably going for a different degree. Maybe it's a transfer degree, maybe it's Bachelor's of Behavioral Health, whatever it might be. You probably have some long-term purpose, and this class is a step towards that. So that effective goal setting of I meet this challenge, I get the papers done, I get good grades on the test, and I do well in this test, that'll build some skills and some knowledge that I can take into my work or my degree, whatever it might be. Short-term accomplishments are also really good. So you want to see yourself accomplishing things. So those specific goals that are a stretch, but you can get soon enough or quickly or easily enough to see that accomplishment can really build both your self-regulation and your self-efficacy. So this is an activity I often do in my classes. It is really connected to self-regulation, but it's towards that long-term purpose. So going back to this slide, so getting to those goals that are long-term, that are beyond yourself, that are important to you. So depending on the kind of class, I probably have an activity like this. You might be doing it in class. It might be an activity for the week. So look at your instructions. It's probably in there. If not, go to this website. This is a great activity. The best possible wand or best possible self activity is a really good one there. Right, the next part of this chapter, we've got motivation and emotion, is emotion. So emotion is tied to motivation, but honestly, this chapter is kind of just a mashup. In other books, they might have motivation and emotion separate. This book puts motivation and emotion together. So emotion, let's start talking about it. Emotion is a feeling, or we call it an affect. And so with that, that's with an A. So if you ever see that, affect is like this. That's a feeling or a physiological arousal because of something happening to you. And so this is really related to things like the autonomic nervous system. So that includes the sympathetic nervous system, which often arouses, like charges you up, fight or flight kind of thing, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms you down, helps you feel more relaxed. Says, okay, that was just a little bird in the bushes, not a velociraptor or something like that. And so that's the difference between that sympathetic and parasympathetic. Here are another couple examples of things that the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system do. So parasympathetic is helping you calm down versus the sympathetic nervous system is helping charge you up. And so this is very tied to both your brain and your hormones. And those hormones, if you remember back to our chapter in week 3, chapter 3 as well on biopsychology, hormones are a body system of communication, just like neurons are, but hormones take a little bit longer. You've got to fill those hormones up to a certain level in the blood. The sympathetic nervous system, some things go really quickly. Adrenaline, for example, you only need a little bit of it to affect a lot of the other systems. Other hormones take a lot more. Melatonin, for example, takes a lot more and has to fill up in your bloodstream to see some of the calm down effects that you might see with melatonin. So one way that we measure arousal of how charged up you are, how much you might be feeling that affect, is skin conductance. So seeing how much sweat you have essentially. So sweaty hands or sweaty arm conducts electricity better than dry hands. And another thing that we do is check hormone levels. You can take a cheek swab or a blood test. So it's a little more invasive and a little more time consuming than a skin conductance test. But that is both some ways that we do this. Another thing that we can use is polygraph, which puts some of these together. So you get that skin conductance level, but you're also measuring heart rate, you're measuring breathing, you might be measuring like oxygenated levels now as well. So you compare neutral versus target questions. But an interesting thing, while we can get a good sense of heart rate, breathing, skin conductance, Polygraphs aren't very good for actually detecting lies. So that being said, police officers may still use them. The results from a polygraph cannot be used in court cases after the Employee Polygraph Protection Act. Or no, wait, that the Employee Polygraph Protection Act was you can't use the polygraphs on employees or like in hiring decisions because they're so unreliable, but you can't use them in legal cases either because again, they're not very reliable. So you may have seen shows where the spy mm, gets past a polygraph. It's not actually that hard when you're just looking at heart rate, breathing, skin conductance level, but it might be used as an intimidation tactic by police officers to suggest that they know more than they actually do know, to convince you to confess, for example. So, with that, fMRIs might actually do a pretty good job at detecting deception, but they're really expensive. So, as of right now, police cars don't have those. They've got some robot dogs, but they don't have fMRIs. So we'll see if that technology becomes cheap enough to change that. So with that, let's watch this funny little video on a couple theories of emotion. So in this video, we're going to be talking about these different theories: the James Lange theory, Cannon-Bard, Singer-Schachter two-factor theory, and these are some different theories of emotion and some examples of, well, when you feel an emotion, so when you feel that affect, let's say there's a snake there, what goes on first? Does your body have a reaction? Do those hormones have a reaction? Do you feel your heartbeat and then you think about why is your heart beating fast? Or do you realize, oh, there's a snake there, and then does your body react? Is it happening at the same time? That's what these different theories are about. So this little video is a kind of funny little one to show some differences between these couple theories. Again, if the video doesn't play, go click on through it in the lecture slide.
Emotions are a tricky subject, both in life and in psychology. Questions like, why do you make me feel this way, are not only confusing on a personal level, but also on a scientific level. First, let's distinguish emotions from feelings and moods. An emotion is Emotions are a tricky subject, both in life and in psychology. Questions like, why do you make me feel this way, are not only confusing on a personal level, but also on a scientific level. First, let's distinguish emotions from feelings and moods. An emotion is an immediate, specific, positive or negative response to internal thoughts or external environmental events. A feeling is the subjective experience of an emotion. It's what we refer to when we say things like, I feel angry, or I feel happy. A mood, meanwhile, is a diffuse, longer-lasting emotional state that doesn't necessarily have an identifiable object or trigger.
So before we move on, I want to clarify these. So talking about an emotional response, this is essentially what we call what your body's doing. You have some specific kind of positive or negative valence, like is this a positive thing that's happening? Is it negative? Is your heart rate rising? Are you sweating? Is your blood pumping? Those kinds of things. And then the feeling is, you could think of it as the name we give to it. Like, what you've got your heart pumping, is this because of love or is this because of anger? Right? That's what we name our subjective experience. Like, we're feeling some emotional response, something in our body. What do we name it? That's the feeling. And then a mood is a little different. It is more long-term, more diffuse. It might not have an identifiable trigger versus the emotion, the quick kind of response to your body that has some kind of identifiable trigger.
So if something frustrating happens to you, you might immediately feel the emotional response of anger, and for the next few days you might be in a bad mood. Let's move on to the various components of an emotion. So we know that emotions are immediate and specific responses. These responses have at least three parts: physiological, cognitive, and behavioral. A physiological component of an emotion might be bodily arousal, like a racing heart or tense muscles. The cognitive components of an emotion is the subjective conscious experience of emotion. And the behavioral components of an emotion is the characteristic overt expressions of the emotion, behaviors that other people can read, like particular facial expressions or postures. Charles Darwin studied this third component of emotions in his 1872 book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, in which he argued that particular emotional responses tend to accompany the same emotional states in all members of a species. So, according to Darwin's argument, all of the members of a species will display the same behavior when they feel a particular emotion. All cats will display the same behavior when they are happy. And all humans will have the same facial expression and behavior when scared. With this evidence, Darwin suggested that the expression of emotion is genetically determined. This behavior has evolved and has been passed down through generations in our genes.
A quick interruption. We'll see in a minute from the lecture that, yeah, this does seem to be the case for a handful of emotions. There's some like subcategories or combination of emotions that may not fit this, but it does seem that for a lot of emotions, they may be kind of evolutionarily and genetically tied. So we'll see that in just a minute.
Let's look at some theories of how emotions work. Let's start with the common sense view. In this view, a stimulus prompts an emotion, which in turn prompts some bodily arousal. So in this case, a frightening spectacle fills our villain with fear, which makes him sweat and makes his heart rate rise. In the mid-1880s, two scholars, William James and Carl Lang, independently came up with similar theories that contradicted this common sense view. James and Lang both suggested that instead of emotions causing bodily arousal causes emotions. So, to return to our previous example, that would mean that the sight of the hero on his threshold makes our villain's heart beat faster, his hands tremble, and his palms sweat, and these physiological changes cause him to feel fear. But this theory is vulnerable to a few criticisms. First, it is possible to have physiological arousal without any accompanied emotion. For instance, your palms might sweat because it's hot, but that sweat won't make you feel nervous, just kind of gross. Second, physiological changes can be too slow to precede the conscious experience of emotion. Our villain might feel scared as soon as he sees our hero, but it might take a few seconds for him to start sweating. Third, the same set of physiological responses are associated with very different emotional experiences. A faster heart rate could mean fear, but it could also mean anger, or surprise, or joy. Finally, there is evidence that physiological feedback is not necessary for emotion. For example, patients with spinal cord injuries who have lost most of their physiological feedback still experience the same emotions as before. However, in the James Lang theory's favor, there is notably some slight evidence of dissipation in their emotional reactions. As an alternative to the James Lang theory, two other theorists, Walter Cannon and Philip Bard, propose that the physiological arousal of emotions and the experience of emotions are entirely separate processes. That is, a stimulus causes the emotion and physiological arousal independently. Neither one causes the other. So the sight of our hero causes our villain both to feel fear and for his palms to sweat and heart to race. But contrary to this theory, there have been many reports of physiological stimuli influencing emotions. So it's unlikely that physiology and emotions are completely disconnected. One suggestion of how arousal and the experience of emotion may be connected, but not causal, was proposed in the 1960s by Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer as the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, which introduces the factor of cognition. The theory suggests that when a stimulus elicits some arousal, this arousal elicits some cognition, which interprets the source of the arousal, and then this interpretation then elicits the experience of emotion. From the stimulus, it takes two different factors, the arousal and the cognition, to elicit the emotion, hence the name Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. For example, say that you feel your face start to flush. According to this theory, you'll automatically use cues from your environment to help explain this flush. You might be mid-workout, or someone might have just confessed their love to you. Although the arousal is the same, the cognitive evaluation of the stimulus is very different across these two scenarios. And so the emotions you would feel would also be very different. Say pride versus shyness, for instance. To return to our previous example, if the sight of our hero makes our villain's heart beat faster, then their cognitive evaluation of the situation, say remembering that the hero is a Secret Service agent here to save the world, or that he is their long-lost love from primary school, will determine their emotional response to the situation. Again, with this theory, it's about the interpretation of the stimuli and the arousal, which leads to the emotion. So let's just quickly review these 4 theories of emotion to help you remember them. First, the common sense view is that a stimulus will cause an emotion, which causes arousal. Second, the James Lange theory reverses emotion and arousal, suggesting instead that a stimulus causes arousal, which then causes emotion. Third, the Cannon-Bard theory separates out emotion and arousal as independent reactions to the stimulus. And finally, the Schechter-Singer two-factor theory adds another factor to the cause of emotion. After a stimulus elicits some arousal, you cognitively assess the stimulus, and that assessment causes the emotion.
So great, silly little video about a bunch of these theories of emotion. So think about times that you've felt an emotion. How do you think that pathway looked? Was it going through your cognition? Was it just your body's feeling? Was it that you all of a sudden had some kind of emotion immediately, then your body did something? What pathway does this take? Does it always take the same pathway? So that is something to consider. So there is some evidence for a lot of these depending on what kind of test that we're looking at. The stimulus leading to arousal, then you perceive that and you label it an emotion. Cannon-Bard theory, you are doing emotion and physical arousal at the same time. Or the two-factor theory, you have a cognitive labeling of the physical arousal becomes the emotion. So which one is it? Well, it's probably different for different experiences. It might be that another theory describes all of this better. So, but that's some ideas of how we've started to look at emotion and what the individual steps are to get to, well, the thing that we label that feeling. So with that being said, another thing is that brain. So we talked about the cognition in the brain. We talked a little bit about like hormones in the body, making you sweat, maybe having adrenaline, having more heart pumping. But dopamine and endorphins are a big part of positive emotions. When people have positive emotions, oftentimes there's more dopamine, there's more endorphins happening at that time. Norepinephrine helps regulate arousal and anxiety. So it's a big piece of that. So, and with any of these, too little or too much can slightly change those. And then serotonin, if you have low serotonin, it's really related to anger, aggression, negative moods. So these are all other pieces of that puzzle. So do we have the neurotransmitters first, then the cognition, and then the body sensation, then label it? How does it all go together? So this is the idea that this is what psychologists studying and focusing on emotion sometimes look at. So me as a positive psychologist, oftentimes some of the things I'm looking at are positive emotions. I'm looking at things like self-regulation, things like purpose in life, things like pro-social behavior, self-efficacy, doing things and choosing things to lead to better things, like setting goals and accomplishing them. But we see that there's evidence of some things being very fast in the brain. So we see that the limbic system is involved in fear. So we get an input, the visual thalamus and the amygdala. They go back to the visual cortex. It's, oh, that's a snake. Hey, you should feel fear. And neurotransmitters change very quickly. But then you can also have an indirect route through sensory cortex. So, oh, something's warm on my hand. What is that? Or something's touching my hand or something like that. What is that? Is that a spider? Is that dust? Is that just a heater turned on or something like that? And now it's blowing hair on my leg or whatever it might be. So these brain processes and specific brain areas are also associated with different types of emotions. So the amygdala, very closely related to fear. But with this, again, emotion is that feeling or something that we call an affect that's related to both that physiological arousal, but it's also conscious experience, behavioral expression, and that behavioral expression can be something like a facial expression. It can be something like someone, um, earlier today, my youngest was a little upset, so they were going, mm. They were kind of just growling and grumping about not getting something that they wanted. I think they wanted ice cream. And it was like, no, you need to eat dinner first. So, what comes first, that feeling or that thinking? So, and depending on the emotion, it may be different depending on what your brain is currently processing, what else it's doing. You may have that emotion or body sensation before that cognition. So, some behavioral factors that we look at with emotion to determine what emotion is someone feeling are things like verbal and nonverbal features. So, what's the facial expression? What are they saying? Are they saying, I'm angry? Are they going, something like that? The facial feedback hypothesis suggests that our facial expressions can influence our emotions. So that suggests that something about the body can change emotions. They tested this in kind of a funny way. I'm pretty sure your book talked about this one. You put if you hold a pencil in your mouth, it actually activates some of the same muscles that are activated when you are smiling. So they tested a couple different people and saw that they reported a little bit more happiness with putting that pencil in their mouth. Also, they might have felt a little bit silly, so other research has done that different ways to try and make it so that people weren't feeling silly, but your body can influence those emotions. So the whole system of how we are doing things, thinking back to the biopsychology chapter, thinking to these things that we might think of as simple, motivation, emotion, they're a big complex part of how we are, who we are, what we do, those kinds of things. So, can you identify the emotions here? So, my face might be in the way in the upper corner. One of them is sadness, one of them is anger, one of them is fear, one of them is happiness, one of them is disgust, and one of them is surprise. So can you label them? Maybe put in your notes like number one is this, two, three, so on and so forth. And then we'll see if you are correct. So these are actors trying to play these roles, so they may or may not be doing a great job, but these are the emotions that they're trying to display. Happiness, anger, sadness, surprise, disgust, and fear. With that, interestingly, one thing that we see from a lot of these emotions is that these come, you could say, these come online very early in life. So if you look at the movie Inside Out, that's probably why they chose some of the emotions that they chose there. Because happiness, anger, sadness, surprise, disgust, fear, these seem to be something that people can experience very early on in life. Some of these immediately after birth can be detected. Some of these in the first 6 months after birth can be detected. But interestingly as well, these emotions seem to have the similar facial expression across cultures in the world. So you go to someone in Polynesian Islands, you go to someone in Aboriginal Australia, you go to someone in um, India, China, Russia, Canada, California, Brazil, Portugal, Argentina. I'm just trying to think about, oh, I completely skipped the whole continent of Africa. So Angola, Egypt, South Africa. Pick people from, let's take Germany too. So take people from all of those areas, and they tend to have the same facial expressions for these emotions, which is really interesting. So it goes back to that thing we were talking about Darwin a few minutes ago. It seems like some of these may be evolved capacities that we as humans have had for a long time. Um, it's a little outside the scope of this class, but I was reading a book really recently on some anthropology research of humans, and it suggests that some of the not our human ancestors, but some of the other hominids that were around the same time as humans, before they died off or we killed them, it seems like based on their skull and muscle structure that we can tell from their skulls, they may have had more subtle facial expressions than Homo sapiens, which is interesting. Maybe we as humans made better groups or liked being around each other who we could see the emotions and we could kind of see what people are thinking and feeling. Maybe that's something that we really like. So it is in some ways adapted for making groups. So some interesting things to think about. With that said, though, it is interesting that while we have the same facial expressions across cultures, display rules do vary. So it may or may not be appropriate to show anger towards, say, a teacher, to a parent, in a church setting, to an elder, right? It might or might not be appropriate to show any given emotion in some setting. That's not to say the facial expression wouldn't be the same, but there are different cultural rules about this is how you should show or not display this or that emotion. So that is different, but the actual facial expression seems to be, for a lot of these basic emotions that we have basically right after we're born, seem to be pretty similar across cultures. So these are some of those universal emotions with distinct facial experiences, and a lot of people across the world pretty much do these same kind of facial expressions. Other thing that we do when classifying emotions is looking at, well, are they positive? Are they negative? Is it high energy or is it low energy? So that is kind of how we classify these. So an example here, ecstasy. So you're feeling so happy, you're ecstatic, you are feeling ecstasy. It's a positive emotion and it's very high energy. Versus contentment. It is positive, it's on that positive side, but it's very low energy. It's like, this is good. Versus negative, fury. You're so mad. That person just cut you off again. You're so mad at them. Or maybe that's just me. Very high energy anger there, fury. Versus negative, boredom. Well, it's not a pleasant thing to feel, but it's a lot lower energy. So that is what we're talking about, the valence of positive versus negative, and the arousal level. Is it high arousal, low arousal? So with this, oftentimes with negative emotions, it drives us, it helps motivate us to take corrective action. If you're feeling sad, if you're feeling guilty, if you're feeling bored, oftentimes it helps us move towards doing something different to not feel that way anymore. So it can be positive. The experience of negative emotions often doesn't feel positive, like we don't like that feeling of the negative, and so we kind of try to get rid of that feeling in some way that we can. Sometimes healthy ways, sometimes unhealthy ways. Interestingly, positive emotions help us broaden and build ourselves. So this video, it's a little long if I remember. I'm going to click on it, but this is not one that we'll watch as a class right now, but I definitely recommend you check it out. I changed my mind. I do want to watch a little bit of this. The whole video is good, but I want to show one example of how positive emotions broaden and build your capacity.
Other studies use a very simple paradigm that was developed by Alice Eisen decades ago, where you give people a gift of candy, all wrapped up in cellophane, so you know it's not a sugar high that's creating but it's a gift, a token. They're either given the gift before the experiment starts or after it's over. In other studies, they have people listen to pleasant music. Now, in these kinds of studies, we know that it changes the way people view, can kind of step back and take in the big picture. Here's a study from my own lab where we gave people a series of tests like this where we showed a comparison figure, a target figure on top, and then asked which of these two comparison figures most resembles this. Now, there's no right or wrong answer. They each resemble it a little bit, but this one resembles it in its global configuration, this one more in its local detail elements. And what we know is that if you inject positive emotions, people are more likely to step back and see the big picture and see the similarities along those lines. Other work on this opening or broadening effect has used eye tracking, where they lock in a camera on the iris and see what people are looking at. And if you give people that little gift of candy before they do a study like this, they're more likely to look around all the different aspects of a complicated array. If you don't give people a gift of candy, they pretty much just look at the center baby and they don't look at the babies on the side. So we know that positive emotions widen the scope of what people are scanning for in the environment.
I definitely recommend you watch the entire video. It's a good one. But the main idea here is that positive emotions, feeling a positive emotion, does change the way your brain processes things around you. So it's partially those hormones in your body having the not having the stress, the high stress that, oh, I need to focus on fight or flight. So it's partially that, but it's also that when you have those positive emotions, when you have the differences of norepinephrine or serotonin, dopamine in your brain, you are able to take in more around you. They've tested in people's peripheral vision, so how far to your sides can you actually see, is wider. You literally can see more. Your brain is processing more of your vision versus when you have a lot of negative emotions, extra stress, you literally do get more tunnel vision. So, like actually your peripheral vision, your focus, you're not able to pick up on things around here because your body and your brain is like, we need to focus on this thing that is going to hurt us or to escape this thing, right? So versus positive emotions, you have the capacity, your brain takes that energy to look bigger picture. We've also tested things like, well, not me specifically, this isn't a piece of research I've done personally, but read the research of things like working memory. So, how many pieces of information can you hang on to and work with to make a new thought, to do creative thinking, to study for a test? Positive emotions, you can hang on to more. So on average, most people are hanging on to like 3 or 4 things at any given time, sometimes 5 with their working memory. When you have a positive emotion, that kind of bumps up 1 on average for people. So all these things together, being able literally to see bigger, to be broader, it is an idea that we can broaden and build a positive upward spiral. So positive emotions literally can make us more capable of doing things. So gets us closer to that self-actualization. Gets us closer to um, uh, things like thinking back to the self-determination theory, to do more things that build our competence, our relatedness, our connectedness, our I just forgot the third part of the model, even though we just talked about it half an hour ago. So the autonomy. So the competence, the autonomy, and the relatedness. So the idea here is that positive emotions literally do broaden and build your capacities. It makes it so you are more capable of doing things. Now, again, that is not to say that negative emotions are bad. Again, that fight or flight to get away from something that it could be very traumatic for you. There's a reason we evolved those capacities so that it could keep us safe. But this is something to think of. These positive emotions can help us as well. So they can give us help with a more positive outlook. It can build our abilities. We also can have emotional wisdom, know how our emotions are affecting us and how we're reacting. So, how things like, did I eat lately? Oh, I might be reacting maybe more negatively. Did I forget my medicine this morning? Did I get enough sleep? That also goes into emotional wisdom. So, with this, I want to talk about happiness specifically. So, positive psychology, we'll talk about this in a couple more weeks in a chapter specifically on stress and then positive psychology. But a lot of it is biological factors. It's about 50 to 80% heritable. We have some kind of happiness set point, and that's kind of like your thermostat. So, about how happy are you generally? A lot of that is just genetic, but there are things that you can do. Right? If you're doing short-lived pleasurable things, you usually get used to those. We call that a hedonic treadmill. So an example of the hedonic treadmill in seeking pleasure seeking or short-lived things, if you say really like going to concerts, if you're doing that every day or once a week, that's going to be not as exciting anymore. Right? If you're going to concerts every 6 months or every year or every 2 years or every 3 years, that is going to be a cool new thing, right? Versus if you're doing that all the time, you're going to get used to it. That's the hedonic treadmill. So that direct pursuit of happiness can backfire, can make it so those things that you're shooting for don't make you as happy. So the really big things that make you more happy go back to that self-determination theory. Things like physical activity is a really good one to help boost both our body, our hormones, our muscles. Things are just working better in general. There's a bunch of body systems that are related to our hormones and our neurons and our neurotransmitters that physical activity really helps. with feeling happiness. A positive self-reflection. So whether it's thinking back on things you're grateful for the day, thinking about what positive things do you have in your life. Altruism, doing good for people tends to make us feel good too, right? If you have personally meaningful goals, things that you want to do, things that you want to accomplish, seeing yourself meet that competence, having relatedness, having close relationships with people around you, making choices. So going back to that self-determination theory, gratitude, like trying to practice gratitude specifically, um, and also other activities that make you happy, setting goals and reaching those things. These are just very briefly some things that can help make you happy in the short term as well as long term, and help kind of avoid some of those aspects or those weaknesses of that hedonic treadmill. So hopefully after this chapter, you understand a lot more about motivation, those needs and drives and homeostasis, all the way to things like self-determination theory and the needs coming from things like that are psychological rather than physical. And we also talked about things like sexual orientation and how that is related to needs and drives of things like sex. And we talked about hunger and eating as examples of motivation. We talked about a lot of different emotions. We kind of focused on positive ones. I'm a positive psychologist, so there you go. But we talked about a bunch of the different theories. So hopefully you've got some good notes and some good questions and ideas about motivation and emotion, because this is just a little taste of it, and that's really a general psychology class. You get a little bit of a lot of stuff, so definitely look into these more, ask questions in the discussion boards, in classes, things like that. So we'll learn more about positive psychology in a couple weeks when we go or looking at the chapter 2 weeks, chapter or week 9 on stress and positive psychology. So a lot of these basics we'll come back to. But that is it for chapter 10 on motivation and emotion.